Hey, what's going on everybody? My name's Ben and I'd like to welcome you to my workshop. If you've been following my channel for a little while, you're probably wondering where the heck I've been. I started a video series called CNC in 3 about 4 or 5 months ago and then completely ghosted everyone. So I wanted to start tonight's video by number one, apologizing for ghosting everyone, and maybe giving you a little bit of background about why I did it in the first place. I've had Crohn's disease since I was 15 or 16, maybe even 17 years old, basically since high school. And like any other chronic illness or autoimmune disorder, it's not exactly something you're proud to have had since high school, if you know what I mean. But if you're not familiar with Crohn's disease, it's a chronic illness, so I'll never get rid of it. It's not something for which they know the cause, so no one knows why I have it. And they also don't know how to cure it. So the best that they can do is treat the symptoms. Sometimes those treatments work and they work really well, and other times they don't. And about 4 or 5 months ago, around Thanksgiving of what was 2021, so not long ago, we were back in Pennsylvania where I grew up, visiting family for the holidays, and my Crohn's flared up and got the best of me. I found myself in the hospital and then I had to have surgery. And with surgery, as you know, comes recovery and all of that. And so I had to take a break from this channel and take a break from life really in general and really get myself on the mend. I'm happy to say that I'm on the mend, obviously, and I'm back to producing YouTube videos and other content. And I'm back here in Boise in my workshop. More importantly, or more excitingly, I'm back in the workshop more or less full time now. I've created a business out of all of this, and if you care to support me and my work, you can check out butlerbuilt.us. I'm making leather aprons and have plans to make and sell other things in the future as well. I'd like that to be a resource for all makers, not just folks who need leather aprons. The plan is to sell jigs and plans and projects and all kinds of things that will help you make things. Speaking about helping you make things, enough about me, enough about my health drama, and let's move on to the topic of tonight's video. Tonight we're going to look at using a CNC machine to help you with a leatherwork project. Now you probably don't associate leatherwork and CNC together very often, but I recently saw a really cool jig that I thought I could easily make on the CNC and even make better. And to take it one step further, it was something I thought I could mass produce and sell on my website. So tonight we're going to talk about all three of those. So if you want to learn how to use your CNC to do leatherwork and maybe make some money, stick around. That's what we're going to get into. The jig that I saw online allowed you to create catch-all trays like the one you see here. You may have seen catch-all trays that are made with rivets or snaps in the corner of a square piece of leather. These are cool. They're really easy to make, but making a tray like this is just killer. Now, the process for making these can be somewhat challenging if you don't have a jig. The process is known as wet molding, and you actually wet the leather or case the leather, and then you stretch it or shape it around a mold. What I'm going to show you how to make is a wet molding jig. And this wet molding jig allows you to very simply and very quickly create catch-all trays like the one I'm holding here. The wet molding process can be a bit difficult, and the starting point is always having a mold. I started with some fairly simple shapes for these jigs, but over time I think you could very easily add some pretty complex shapes to the mix and make some really cool and unique trays. The jig's really simple. It consists of 3 parts. You have the stretcher, we have the base, and we have the mold. There are a few critical dimensions that we need to understand and some properties of leather that we also need to understand. So let's come in a little closer and we'll take a look. The first and arguably most important thing about this process for you to know is that you need to use a vegetable tanned leather. I buy my veg tan leather from Wickett and Craig Tannery. They are over in Pennsylvania where I grew up, which is really cool. It is one of 2 remaining vegetable tanned tanneries in the country, and they just make some killer leather. The next consideration we need to take into account is the thickness of your leather. This is important because it will determine how large we make this stretcher piece. If we make it too large, it won't stretch the leather nice and tight to your mold. And if you make it too small, you won't be able to get it down over the leather. So one of the first things you need to do is consider your finished product and how you want to make it. For the catch-all tray I'm holding here, I decided that I wanted finished leather on the top and the bottom, and so I ended up using 2 pieces of leather. Here in the US, leather is measured in ounces when you're looking at the thickness, which is really annoying and doesn't really make any sense to me or probably anybody else. But thankfully I picked up a little cheater card from my friends at Wickett and Craig, and it outlines ounces and then converts it to millimeters, which is what everybody else in the great world uses. And then it also looks at fractions and it shows you the decimal equivalents as well. You can find charts like this online. Just a simple Google search, leather thickness conversion chart or something should get you there. So my leather here, this really nice burgundy veg tan, I knew was 4.5 to 5 ounce. What I always recommend is if you have some calipers, you measure the thickness of the leather in a few places just to check it against any reference chart you might be using. But looking at this, 4 ounce leather measures 0.0625 inch and 5 ounce leather is 0.7813 inch. So basically 4 ounce is a 1/16 of an inch and 5 ounce is 5/64 of an inch. If you're making a mold like this, the mold itself can be any shape or size. It really doesn't matter. I wouldn't go much larger than say about 9, maybe 10 inches, but for the most part it can be any shape that you'd like. Where we're going to use that leather thickness is determining how large to oversize our stretcher piece here. So if we take our leather thickness and multiply it by 2, because we know the leather is going to come down on either side, that will give us the amount by which we need to oversize our stretcher. Now VCarve Pro makes things fairly easy because it considers this shape a square. So it essentially takes the X and Y extremes and builds a bounding box around it. So we can apply whatever oversizing we want to that square on 2 sides, this side and this side, and it will then oversize the shape for us perfectly. We'll see it more when we get into the actual software, but for now it's just important to understand how to get to that number. The other consideration at play here is the number of layers of leather that you're going to use. So a pretty good rule of thumb that I've come up with is to take the thickness of your leather, you could measure it with calipers or use a conversion chart, multiply that by 2, and then multiply it by the number of layers of leather you're going to use to create your catch-all tray. Once you have that number, you'll know how much larger to make your actual stretcher. All of the stretchers that I sell are oversized when compared to the mold by 3/8 of an inch. That's 3/16 on either side, and I think it works very well for 2 layers of 4 to 5 ounce veg tan, or 1 layer of about an 8 to 10 ounce veg tan. So now that we know how to oversize our stretcher when compared to our mold, we can go ahead and dive into designing these shapes on the CNC. Okay, here we go in VCarve Pro, and I'm going to run through this incredibly quickly because you can slow it down and hear my voice get really weird. In the job setup, I had a 12-inch by 12-inch piece of 3/4 inch plywood, and we're going to cut 2 different thicknesses out of the same setup here, but for now it'll work. The inner red shape is the mold, and as you saw, it was 6 by 6.5 inches, and the outer blue shape is going to be the stretcher piece. Now I oversized that stretcher when compared to the mold by 3/8 of an inch, or 0.375. I keep the link XY box checked and just oversize one of the sides, and the software does the rest. Now when you're generating your tool paths, there's only a couple things to keep in mind. Number one, when you're cutting your mold, you're going to do a profile tool path on the outside of the line. And I cut those out of 3/4 plywood, so I leave that 0.75 set for the cut depth. When you're cutting your stretchers, or the blue shape, you want to do that same profile toolpath, but this time make sure you check the box that says cut on the inside of the line. That will make sure your offset's correct and everything works out when you go to stretch the leather. Now I use a 1/4 inch down cut bit from Onsrud, LMT Onsrud. You can get those bits on the ShopBot website, and I've been using the same one for over a year now, and it just keeps on cutting and leaving a perfect finish on the face of plywood. So why change, I figure. Anyway, once you have those tool paths generated, you can very simply just export them out, and then we're going to get to cutting on my favorite tool in the shop, the ShopBot Desktop Max. Once we cut those shapes out on the CNC, we can take them over to the router table and round over the top side edge. I'm using a 1/2 inch round over bit here, and it leaves a really nice profile for a small catch-all tray. Assembling the jig is a very simple process. Basically, you just have to attach the mold itself to the base. Here I'm attaching it to the center point, but you could assemble it any way you want. I ship my jigs as 3 pieces, and that's because someone might want to do something a little bit different. Once you have your jig assembled, you're ready to start mass producing catch-all trays. I start by casing the leather or getting it wet, and I'll leave it soaking here for about 8 to 10 minutes. It makes this really cool ripply sound when you first put it in the water. Obviously, the longer you leave it soak, the longer it will take to dry out. You could probably get away with just giving it a good dunk in here and then moving right to stretching it. Stretching is a very simple process as well, and you basically just lay the leather over your mold. In this example, I probably cut my leather a little bit large. A good rule of thumb is about 1 inch to 1.25 inches larger than the mold. Regardless, as I said earlier, you just lay however many layers of leather you have over your mold. In this case, I've got 2 layers that I'm stretching. Make sure you have no wrinkles or ripples, and then you put the stretcher piece over the top. Once it's all sandwiched together, I just put clamps on all 4 sides. I'm using F-style clamps, but you could certainly use some squeeze clamps, or really any clamp will do. You're just trying to get that stretcher pushed down good into the mold. I let this one dry overnight, but I've experimented in the past with a shorter set time, and it works nearly as well. If you just keep it under clamps with the stretcher applied for a couple of hours, you can lift the leather up off the mold and let some air get underneath it, and it'll really speed up the drying process. After popping the leather from the mold, you have a few options for cleaning up the edges. I like a little bit of an overhang on these hexagonal trays, so I've got about a 1/4 inch gap there that I marked out with my wing dividers. From there, I'll just slice off the excess leather, and then we'll move on to actually finishing or burnishing the edges and doing a few more cleanup steps. I'll start with my edge beveler, and that will give me a nice rounded edge on the top and bottom side of the leather. I use a 9/16 or 14mm corner round punch here to just give those corners a little bit of a rounded edge. From there, it's time to glue everything together, and I'm using Tanner's Bond contact cement here, but really any leather glue will work. I went ahead and marked an arrow on both layers so that I can get the two pieces back together correctly. I'll apply glue to both sides. I only show one here in the video, but applying glue to both sides ensures that we have good contact, and essentially that's the way contact cement works. I've found that using the mold when gluing the layers together works really well. This will make sure you don't smush everything down and deform the tray itself. I always rub over all of the edges. I pay particular attention to the very outer edges of the tray to make sure I have a good bond. From there, I hit the edges with some dye, and here I'm just using a brown dye. And then once that's done, I can go ahead and use a burnishing tool. I have mine attached to a Dremel, but you could use a manual burnishing tool as well. Either works just as good. To finish off the edges, I seal the dye in with Tokonol burnishing cream. I use a piece of canvas cloth to rub it in, and once it's dry, that dye should be locked in and it won't transfer onto your shirt or someplace that you don't want it to end up. Back on the mold here, I'm just giving it a little extra shaping and making sure that all of my edges are nice and buttery smooth. I wanted to kick this tray up a notch, so I carved a stamp on my ShopBot. This is a piece of linoleum carving block or stamp block. You can get it at most hobby stores, and I'll put a link down in the description where you can find it online. I know this is probably not the most durable leather stamp in the world, but I figure I can always carve a new one on my ShopBot if this one wears out. The advantage to carving my stamp out of a linoleum block is that it can also be used as a traditional ink stamp for packaging or other places I'd like to put my new logo. Speaking of my logo change, if you follow me over on Instagram, you may have noticed that I've rebranded my page to butlerbuilt.us. This rebrand has actually been in the works for a while now, and I wanted to move away from the Benjamin Butler Company to a brand name that better fit the things that I make and the products that I want to sell. The current state of the online store is just the tip of the iceberg, so please check back regularly for product updates and new additions to the mix. The goal behind Butler Built is to make phenomenal products that help you make cool things, or to help you make the cool things that you already make all that much better. Well, alright y'all, we're going to wrap up the video there with a few beauty shots of that tray we've been working on. I think this thing turned out amazing. I've been making these catch-all trays and the jigs to make them left and right lately, and it is just such a fun process. Remember, if you care to order a kit for yourself, you can find them over at butlerbuilt.us. And in the meantime, I would appreciate it so much if you'd consider clicking the subscribe button down below, give the video a thumbs up, and please let me know how I'm doing down in the comments section. I genuinely enjoy chatting with folks down in the comments, So whether you have something positive to say or a piece of feedback for ways that I can improve, please don't be shy. Let me know down below.